So the Biden administration is now telling us there will be a Russian invasion of Ukraine before the end of the night. Of course, nobody is rooting for that, including us. No one wants to see bloodshed or war ever, anywhere. No one on this show is rooting for Putin or rooting for the Ukrainians, for that matter. We're always rooting for peace, for real. The question is, what's going to happen, and who do you ask about what's likely to happen? It's hard to trust anybody. The man we trust is retired Colonel Doug Macgregor. And so that's who we're asking tonight to make sense of all of this for us. Doug, thanks so much for coming on. What do you think is going to happen, and what does it mean?
Well, first, Doug, let me just reiterate something that, like you and millions of Americans, I really would prefer that the troops that are headed to Eastern Europe right now were headed to the Mexican border. Yeah. But I'm also very concerned that we find a way to avoid a conflict with Russia. And the first thing we've got to do is acknowledge that Putin's basic point, not just his point, the Russian government's point, which they've made for 25 years, is valid. They don't want U.S. forces and missiles and NATO troops immediately across the border in eastern Ukraine. Absolutely. We didn't want them in Cuba. He doesn't want them in eastern Ukraine. We should acknowledge that. Stop pretending that's a non-issue. It is a major issue for them. Let's acknowledge it. And let's get down to business and then tell them, fine, our concern at this point is we don't want you to proceed west towards the Polish border over the Dnieper River in Ukraine. In other words, you're going to go into eastern Ukraine. That's pretty obvious. That's what the troop disposition suggests. We understand it. We would prefer not, but ultimately we do understand your point. We acknowledge it. We are ready to neutralize Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have to be in NATO, neither does Georgia, and we can discuss those terms of neutrality. Now, if you will accept those terms, then let's talk about the other things that are important. The INF Treaty, making that relevant again. What about where troops are near borders and when they're not near borders and how they'll exercise? We can sort through all of that. We have refused to do this. And because we've refused it, we're going to watch as 130,000, 140,000 troops go into eastern Ukraine in the next few days. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it.
So it does sound like this is happening. And very quickly, what do you think the Biden administration will do in response?
I think they're going to do what we've seen thus far, which has been totally ineffective. Ignore anything the Russians say, threaten them with sanctions that, frankly speaking, are not very meaningful for the Russians. They can find ways around them. They found ways around them before. All of this righteous indignation about entering Ukraine, which is an artificial construct. A third of that country isn't Ukrainian and never has been. So the bottom line is there's nothing we can do. We're going to look foolish and stupid. The real question is, what about the Europeans? Only 26% of Americans think we should even be involved in this. What about the Europeans? Where are the Germans? Well, the Germans have no armed forces. How can you possibly be taken seriously when you have nothing? There's nothing between Germany and the Russians but the Polish army.
Such a good point. Doug Macgregor, thanks so much for joining us, as always.